This video is brought to you by Squarespace. If you need a website or domain, check out squarespace.com. Hey everyone, and welcome back to a new video. Have you struggled with getting your settings right when the light and environment keeps changing? And did you know that manual isn't actually the most advanced mode on your camera? In this video, I'll show you how to shoot using one of your camera's most powerful tools, Aperture Priority. I'll show you real-life examples of using it in the field, as well as some troubleshooting, and how I use it to get shots like this and this. My name is Simon D'Entremont, and I'm a professional nature and wildlife photographer living in Eastern Canada. I make weekly videos giving you photo tips or taking you behind the scenes for nature photography. Subscribe if you want to see more.
Try to open up your mind sometimes. You'll be just fine.
Okay, let's start off with the fundamentals on the mode dial on your camera. It has several types of controls that change how your camera reacts to the three main settings that control image brightness: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. In automatic, the camera does it all for you. It sets these as needed. Program mode allows you to change one or two of the settings and the camera does the rest. The challenge with these is that the camera doesn't always know the scenario and what you want your photos to look like. That's why we have modes that offer you more control, like full manual, where you control all three settings. But in scenarios where the light is always changing, altering your settings for each and every shot or lighting scenario for a day's shooting can be a real pain. What if you could manage certain settings that were important to you, but let the camera control the rest? That's where Aperture Priority comes in. And why did I say earlier that manual isn't the most advanced mode on your camera? 3 reasons. First, it's the mode that least takes advantage of the amazing technology in your camera, dumbing it down to manually having to do everything. Secondly, Aperture Priority is more popular for many pros than manual in plenty of genres. Ask a pro portrait photographer that shoots outdoors in variable light. And 3, and this is surprising for many, most pros who shoot in Aperture Priority do so not because they can't use manual well, but do so after having mastered manual and see it as better than manual. And by the way, I'm not anti-manual. When the light is controlled or constant and you have time to fiddle, it offers great control. But that's not always the case. So Aperture Priority, A or AV on your mode dial, is called so because it's saying that setting the right aperture is the priority in your photo. This might be the case when having an exact shutter speed isn't important, but controlling your depth of field is critical, like if you want a soft blurry background or you want to ensure the whole image is within the depth of field. So when you choose Aperture Priority on your camera, you set the aperture and the ISO, and your camera chooses the shutter speed automatically, and in hundredths of a second, continuously changing the shutter speed to balance the exposure to get the light meter to 0 and your photo well exposed. Let's see how this works with my owl buddies. I set my ISO to 800. Using my 24-70 f2.8 at 2.8, I get a nice thin depth of field, maybe like if I was shooting portraits of a model. The camera selects the shutter speed for me very quickly, this time 1/500th of a second. And in this scenario, I don't care if it's 1/100th, 1/500th, or 1/5000th. The photo will look exactly the same. But when the sun comes out from behind a cloud and through the windows in my kitchen, the scene brightens. It raises the shutter speed to 1/1000th from 1/500th to get the same exposure level. It needs to darken the scene by 1 stop, so it doubled the shutter speed all by itself. I was able to keep the brightness the same without doing anything. And here's an important point about shooting in Aperture Priority. Unless you're trying to get some artistic movement in the shot, there's no penalty for having too fast a shutter speed in Aperture Priority. If 1/100th is fast enough for your needs, any shutter speed above that is okay. 1/200th, 1/800th, 1/2000th, you don't care. So letting the camera adjust the shutter speed to get the right exposure within those ranges you're comfortable with comes without penalty. Now what if I wanted to make the depth of field deeper to get both owls in focus at the same time? I can change the aperture to f13 for a deeper depth of field. And see, again, the brightness level in the photo didn't change. I take a photo and the shutter speed is 1/30th of a second. But this much longer shutter speed, letting in more light, was needed to make up for the fact that my aperture was much smaller, letting in less light. Now what if I change the ISO? Let's get the ISO down from 800 to 200. What happens? See, as I lower the ISO down to 200 for a less bright image, the camera automatically adjusts the shutter speed to 1/160th, again, keeping the image brightness the same. And in this scenario, I don't care what the shutter speed is, the image looks identical. So in Aperture Priority, you can adjust the aperture or the ISO, and the scene can change in brightness, and the image brightness will stay the same, adjusted by your camera automatically by changing the shutter speed. This will allow you to make creative choices and accommodate changes in lighting in the scene without extra intervention by you, and much faster than you can do it manually. Now with any semi-automatic mode, understanding exposure compensation is important. Cameras can be quick, but they can't read your mind in terms of your creative vision. In this scenario, there's room on the right of the histogram to expose the photo a bit brighter without clipping the whites. So I move the exposure compensation, which I have programmed to a dial, to the right to add exposure and to the left to make the image darker. And here's another important point about Aperture Priority. When you use exposure compensation in this mode, it changes the image brightness by changing the variable you've left the camera to decide, the shutter speed. I'd like to thank the sponsor of this video, Squarespace. If you haven't heard of them, they're an all-in-one website platform that helps you create your website from scratch, just like I did. You don't need any coding experience or even be tech savvy. They have lots of templates to choose from to make it easy to get your own website up and running in no time. Even though they have great templates for genres like photography, the place to go now is to use Blueprint AI, their cutting-edge AI website builder, helping you tailor your own website to your own needs. And get discovered fast with integrated Squarespace SEO tools. Every website is optimized to be indexed with meta descriptions and auto-generated sitemap. It looks really professional to have online galleries in your own domain, and a website is also a great way to monetize your work by setting up an online store using Squarespace payments. Go to squarespace.com to sign up for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Simon for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. So now we've got the fundamentals down, let's put this into practice in real life. So I recently went out to photograph singing birds in cold, calm conditions in hopes of catching one of my favorites, the bird breath shot. And I used Aperture Priority the whole morning because I knew that the light would be constantly changing. There was also some partial cloud cover that would make the amount of light even more variable. So my setup for this was using my Canon 600mm lens with a 1.4 teleconverter, giving me effectively 840mm f5.6. My aperture options for this session are that I can shoot them wide open at f5.6 if I want to have the background smooth as silk, as the background will be very out of focus, as an 840mm lens at f5.6 has a razor thin depth of field. Another option is that I might want to stop the lens down to, let's say, f8 or f10-11 to make sure that all of the bird is in focus, or to ensure that its breath floating away from the focus point, which is the bird's eye, is in focus. So here are my singing birds, red-winged blackbirds, and song sparrows. I set the aperture and the ISO, and the camera is setting the shutter speed for me. But maybe I want to get more of this beautiful thorny branch in focus. I manually change the aperture to f10 or f13. See how now the entire branch is in focus, and I can see some of the features in the background, giving the photo a bit more character. So now we know how Aperture Priority works and we've seen it in the field, but let's start looking at troubleshooting some of the more common issues that you may come across. As I started shooting birds early in the morning, the light was quite low, and I set my camera to f13 to get all of the thorns that the sparrow was perched on in focus. To let in more light, the camera chooses a slow shutter speed, keeping the shutter open, 1/30th of a second. But this raises problem number one that we need to troubleshoot. While I said earlier that there's no penalty to have too fast a shutter speed, there is one to have too slow a shutter speed. You need a certain minimum shutter speed to freeze the camera movement and subject movement. Now how do we fix this? Luckily, many cameras allow you to control minimums and maximums on your settings. In this case, to shoot these birds with a long telephoto lens, I need at least 1/500th of a second. So now I set that minimum in my settings, and now in Aperture Priority, 1/500th of a second is the slowest shutter speed that my camera will set. Okay, troubleshooting problem number two. When shooting in Aperture Priority, why are you seeing an underexposed photo and the shutter speed blinking? When this happens, your camera is telling you that it's lowered the shutter speed as low as it can, and it would like to go lower, but it's hit the minimum shutter speed available or that you've set in the settings. There are three fixes for this. The first is to increase the ISO. Remember that at a fixed aperture, there is a reciprocal relationship between ISO and shutter speed. Faster shutter speeds darken the exposure, so higher ISOs are needed to compensate, and vice versa. So if you want higher shutter speeds, raise your ISO if you have room to do so without getting image noise that you can't handle. So my ISO 200 here wasn't enough to properly expose the scene at 1/500th of a second, the minimum that I'd set. So I increased it to ISO 1600, which on my camera still produces great image quality. No problem. What else can we do if the shutter speed is too slow? The next option is to open that aperture up a bit more. Here I'd set the minimum shutter speed to 1/1000th and had ISO 1000. I was getting blinking on my 1/1000th shutter speed. I could have opened up my aperture to f4 by removing the teleconverter and shooting wide open. And thirdly, you can set your ISO to auto. That means you can set the aperture and the camera sets the ISO and shutter speed. This is a great option for many. It reduces your photography down to one variable, the aperture, allowing you to focus on the photography variables that really matter for great photos, finding great subjects, great compositions, and great scenes. I mentioned earlier how raising the ISO can raise the shutter speed. This isn't always about getting the minimum shutter speed above your set lower limit. In this scenario, the bird was getting fidgety and doing some stretching, and it looked like it would jump from its perch anytime. So I wanted more depth of field to catch the jump or the stretch, so f8 or f10 would be best. But my shutter speed was at 1/1250th of a second, a bit too slow for a flight shot of a small bird, so I raised the ISO manually to ISO 4000 to get the shutter speed to increase to 1/3200th, enough for a small, fast bird. Now I mentioned exposure compensation earlier to make adjustments and that you could use auto ISO to keep the ISO in a better range for the rest of the settings you're using. I noticed that the breath shot looks even better with darker exposures, so I lowered exposure compensation even more, -1 1/3 stops underexposed. What does the camera do? The shutter speed is as low as it can go, and the aperture is fixed, so it lowers the ISO from ISO 800 to 500 to darken the image. By the way, if you want to learn about how to shoot the breath of birds, the next few weeks, the spring right now as I record this, is the best time of year in many areas in the Northern Hemisphere that's coming out of winter. And I have a whole video on how to do it, which was my very first YouTube video, by the way. You can see that right here. I hope you can use this knowledge to go out and start shooting in Aperture Priority, so you can get out there and take your own unique and amazing photos. I know you can do it.